name is Rashika Choudhary, and I'll be presenting on financial incentives for land restoration in the United States. For our agenda, first, we're going to be looking at the problem and what land degradation is and what exactly land restoration means. Then I'm going to introduce our client, the World Resources Institute, and how our research fits into their work. Then I'll talk more specifically about our project and the scope of it. And lastly, I'll conclude with some of the challenges we've experienced, as well as our next steps. So the problem in this case is land degradation, which is an enormous issue caused by deforestation, unsustainable agriculture, and climate change. And consequences of degraded landscapes include the loss of critical habitats, decreased agricultural productivity, and the reduced capacity for capturing and storing carbon. Globally, 3 billion people face the consequences of land degradation, and in the US, the annual cost of erosion from agriculture alone is over $44 billion, which means that we need sustainable solutions. One of these solutions is land restoration, which has a broad definition, but generally seeks to make degraded ecosystems healthier by increasing ecological productivity. And specifically for our project, we are examining this through the lens of nature-based solutions, which includes actions such as protecting, managing, and restoring forests, adopting regenerative agriculture practices, and more generally restoring the natural balance of various ecosystems in a way that benefits people and the environment. So our client is the World Resources Institute, which is a global think tank and research organization that does work in 60 countries as of now. Their mission is to move human society to live in ways that protect Earth's environment and its capacity to provide for the needs of current and future generations. We are specifically working with WRI's Global Restoration Initiative, and in prior years, capstone project teams have worked with this initiative as well to research restoration policies in developing countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and India. And now our team is focusing in on the United States. So for our project, the purpose is to identify scalable land restoration policies with financial incentive mechanisms that can be replicated more broadly across the United States of America. And the goal for our database is to build upon past frameworks and adapt it for the United States, such that it's useful in WRI algorithms. Our project is also meant to work in tandem with WRI's Policy Accelerator, which will analyze websites using an algorithm in order to find policies that, in order to find relevant policies. Our analysis will also provide context for the restoration policies that it discovers. Also, our final deliverable includes a report that highlights our findings at the state and federal level. So as for methodology, in order to conduct our research, we began by identifying federal and state level policies and programs by using various government websites. We then split into 3 teams to research policies in depth and enter them into a preliminary policy database. Now, we also conducted interviews with policy experts from government agencies and research organizations. Now we are collaborating and consulting with WRI's data team and policy consultants in order to build our final policy database to be incorporated into WRI's Policy Accelerator. The final database will include the policy as well as analysis, a primary incentive, the land use type, the type of degradation it is aiming to restore, as well as the nature-based solution and restoration mechanism. So our initial approach was to broadly understand the scope of restoration work in the US by researching state and federal level policies, as well as the actors involved. Through our initial research and discussions with our client and experts in the field, we did end up narrowing down the scope of our project to focus on incentives for privately owned land restoration. This is because economic and financial incentives such as tax credits or land easements are just easier to trace when it's geared towards private landowners. Also, as you can see in the map, 61% of all land in the United States is privately owned. So just looking at private lands gives us a larger scope. That said, we specifically chose to do thorough research in California, Colorado, and Maryland because of their progressive policies, varied ecosystems, and representation of 3 different US regions. So first in California, we chose it because it is representative of the Western United States with various ecosystems and landscapes ranging from coastal lands, deserts, mountains, forests, and more. California does face many threats because of this that degrade the landscape, including wildfires, flooding, coastal degradation, soil depletion, and drought, and deforestation. However, California also has many progressive restoration policies that help combat these issues. One example of this is California's Forest Legacy Program, which is managed by the United States Forest Service in partnership and implemented under the state agencies to encourage the protection of privately owned forest lands through easements or land purchases. Protection of private forests through this program maintains a multitude of public benefits, including preventing wildfires. So next with Colorado, it's unique because it has over 60 ecological systems due to its unique geography, as well as elevational grading across the state, which allows for prairie fields to mountain forests to woodlands, canyons, and more. Some of the environmental threats, though, include water shortages, wildfires, land erosion, soil depletion, and deforestation. One way that Colorado does address these problems is through the Great Outdoors Colorado program, which aims to boost local economies through tourism and protect local communities through things like wildfire management. This program has committed over $1.3 billion in order to provide various financial incentives such as grants, easements, and land purchases in order to fund preservation and restoration projects for parks, wildlife, and nature, as well as private lands. And to date, over 5,000 restoration projects have been launched under this program. And the last state we looked at is Maryland, which ranges from mountains, forests, wetlands, as well as estuaries. And some of the environmental threats as a result include flooding, deforestation, soil degradation, urban sprawl, as well as chemical contamination. One example, though, of a successful restoration initiative has been the Maryland Nutrient Trading Program, which allows businesses and farmers to generate credits by improving water quality. They can then sell these credits through state marketplace to businesses that have a negative impact on water quality, which in turn raises the price of pollution. In the end, by placing a price on pollution, the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay is improved. And in this state that depends on fishing industry, preserving the quality of the bay is really a key economic development initiative. And at the same time, it does reward farmers for pesticide-free agricultural practices, which in turn also improves the soil quality. I just also like to note here that although we aren't explicitly focused on water restoration, this was particularly an example due to its direct impacts on agriculture. So some of our biggest challenges so far in this project has been defining the problem as well as project terminology, as well as just refining the scope of the project alongside the World Resources Institute to be something useful for them and their algorithms, as well as accomplishable within our time frame. Concepts including restoration, nature-based solutions, and incentives can be quite broad, so it was difficult to define them within the context of our project initially. And because the Global Restoration Initiative has also yet to examine the United States, and because restoration is such a broad topic, we have to quickly get a handle on the status of restoration work across this country before actually narrowing down our focus. This is partly because that restoration work in the US is done by multiple government agencies, which is quite different than other countries that WRI has looked at. Consequently, a third challenge we faced was navigating the many different state and federal level agencies to identify and understand the restoration policies, especially because of many of these policies are actually implemented as various programs at a state level as well. So now that we've been able to address and look at some of these challenges, some of the next steps for our team include working with WRI's data team to continue our research in our selected states much more in depth. Then we will continue to create a policy database. And finally, we will conduct a cross-state analysis and comparison in order to examine the similarities and differences in restoration policies so we can identify scalable successes. Thank you for listening, and I'll now take any questions you may have.
Again, very good job. Good job, team. Good job, Rashika. If we have some questions, Stephanie will recognize you.
All right, Elizabeth, you can go.
Hi, Rashika, great job. I was just wondering, in your research so far, what are the main barriers to restoration that you've come across?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are a few barriers that I kind of learned about when we did our interviews. So one, of course, is that restoration is quite an expensive thing to do, and money is always an issue. However, another really interesting barrier is that for things like easements or land purchases, people like private landowners tend to be quite skeptical about this because they really don't want the government being involved out of fear of them, owning their land or something like that. So that's been a really interesting barrier, and there's a lot of work being done to kind of incentivize that a little bit more. One last barrier I would say would also be like competing incentives or competing policies that maybe incentivize practices that contribute to land degradation, such as logging, mining, and so forth. So yeah, thank you for that question.
All right, Alina, you can ask your question.
Great presentation, Rashika. It sounds like an amazing project and a great opportunity to make a change. So regarding the expert interviews that you mentioned, I was wondering what government agencies, representatives that you got a chance to speak with. And the second part of my question is, what was the biggest challenge in conducting these interviews?
So we've kind of looked at a few people who work in like Department of Interior, for example. A few challenges, and sorry, was your question a few challenges in conducting these interviews? Personally, I feel like conducting these interviews have been pretty smooth. We've been quite organized in the process, and it's been a fun process because we really started out with such a broad focus that these interviews have actually helped us really narrow down what's actually happening with information that's not actually available online or like difficult to find online. So I'd say it's been much more helpful than difficult, to be honest.
Right, Rachel, you have the last question.
Hi, Rashika. I thought the example of the Maryland treatable credit scheme was really interesting. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Is it required for certain polluting businesses, or is it voluntary? And is it a statewide program or limited to the Chesapeake Bay region?
That is a fantastic question. I believe it is a state-run program, but focusing on the Chesapeake Bay area. I will have to get back to you and a little bit more information on that. Also, if anyone wants to comment in the chat to expand on that, we are kind of still in the process of researching it a little bit more in depth, but yeah, no, I think it's such a fascinating idea.